Hi, everyone. This is once again the Jewish history class at Flagler College with Dr. Young. Today's discussion is about anti-Semitism in the modern era, specifically in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this is actually a fairly complicated topic. It's not one that our textbook deals with at any great length. It's one that I do want to make you acquainted with, though, because to understand, well, the Holocaust and other things, we really need to know this deeper background. Plus, this is kind of a theme we've been following all through the semester, the interaction between Jews and the surrounding society, and often the hostility evinced by the majority religion or the majority ethnicity in the society, whether that's the Muslim Middle East or Christian Europe. Anti-Semitism is something very different, though, and I hope that that'll become clear as we talk about this. Scholars have tried to differentiate. I'm realizing now, looking at that print is very small. My apologies for that. Hopefully, you can have a powerful set of lenses to see the text here. Anyway, scholars have differentiated between two different phenomena, one that they have called anti-Judaism and another that they have called anti-Semitism. And this is actually a fairly recent distinction that was made only in the last few decades. And I think in sort of common parlance, in the popular imagination, anti-Judaism is not a term that's often used. We might say something is anti-Jewish, but anti-Semitism is the term that's really captured people's imagination. But there is a big difference between the type of animosity displayed during the Middle Ages, for instance, where during the Crusades or in a few other instances, Christians lashed out against Jews and even killed them in fairly large numbers. But this was motivated primarily by religious sentiment that the Jews were not fulfilling their function within a Christian society, that they, in the kind of heightened emotional atmosphere of the Crusades, that the Jews were an enemy of Christ, the killers of Christ, in fact, and it didn't make sense for them to go off and fight the Muslims in the Holy Land to reclaim the homeland of Christ, while the Jews were still in Christian Europe doing their thing. That is an example of what scholars have called anti-Judaism, right? Persecution of Jews or hatred of Jews on the basis of a religious difference. And one of the things that scholars have pointed out about anti-Judaism is once the Jew has converted to Christianity, for the most part at least, the Jew is then accepted in Christian society, right? Especially if there is some distance between the conversion and the evaluation of the Jewish convert, or maybe his children or his grandchildren, right? Eventually, the Jewish identity begins to disappear. Now, this is different from anti-Semitism, where the behavior of the Jew, the religion of the Jew, does not matter, where there is a sense that there's something intrinsic about the Jew that makes him or her an object of hatred, an object that cannot be tolerated in the surrounding society. Anti-Semitism, sorry, let me take a drink there. Anti-Semitism is often, in a kind of broader conceptual sense, anti-religious as much as it is anti-Jewish. And the term itself is highly problematic. Now, there are a couple different ways to write this, and you may have noticed that I'm doing this without a hyphen between the anti and the Semitism. That is by choice. That is a purposeful decision. Because the term itself, if you put the hyphen in there then, and take away the anti, for instance, right, there is this term Semitism. Well, there is no such thing as a Semite. I suppose it could be said that a Semite is somebody who speaks a Semitic language, But anti-Semitism has never been something directed against speakers of other Semitic languages, or frankly, against speakers of Semitic languages in general, right? It's not that the Jews speak Hebrew, because, in the period when this arose, Jews were not speaking Hebrew. They were speaking the European languages for the most part. They may have known some Hebrew for religious purposes, but they weren't speaking Hebrew. And so this is not a hatred of Semitic-speaking peoples: Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, ancient Ugaritic, Ethiopian, Ge'ez, or Amharic. I mean, these are all Semitic languages, but anti-Semitism does not direct its animosity toward them, right? The term itself was invented in the mid-19th century specifically to refer to Jews and to differentiate this type of animosity from hatred of Jews as practitioners of a religion. This was explicitly a racial category. And there was an assumption that Judaism or Jewishness was a racial thing, that there was, in fact, a Jewish race. Or, as the term developed, a Semitic race, which was coterminous with a Jewish race. So to write it as anti-Semitism is to propose, at least this is what some scholars have argued and why they have fought against the hyphenated term, it's to propose that there is such a thing as a Semitic race. And there's not. There is no, being Jewish is not being part of a racial category. That was the 19th century formulation that has been overturned in every possible way. Hence, the term anti-Semitism without a hyphen, just as a phenomenological thing, right? That this is a phenomenon of European, for the most part, European psychology, though it has spread to other parts of the world now. And that's how we're going to deal with it. If you have questions about the differentiation between those terms, again, please feel free to ask this on discussion boards. We don't want to completely dismiss the Christian legacy, because this plays into the racial anti-Semitism of the 19th century. These racial thinkers, racial theorists, and even racial sort of political figures who were arguing that Jews ought to be expunged from their societies, often did so with the same rhetoric that had been used against Jews, from the time of the Middle Ages. That is, they were the killers of Christ, that they were the enemies of Christianity and a properly ordered Christian society. And so that rhetoric continued, right? But added to that were a lot of other things that we want to explore here. Okay, so we need to be aware of this, and it's important to acknowledge that persists, at least in rhetorical terms, if not for some, at least in religious terms. But on the other hand, from the 17th century on, religion, and we should probably say specifically Christianity, had declined as a social and political force due to the horrors of the 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Westphalia. There was a little appetite, and this remains so, a little appetite to fight over religion. Truth claims of religions continued, but were blunted by this. And most especially in the political and social spheres, Christianity ceased to be the single most important, and in many cases the only issue that political figures and kind of social thinkers would pay attention to, right? And that continued through the Enlightenment, and we've talked a little bit about this in the class, that Enlightenment thinkers were really trying to establish a society and societies and political systems that were divorced from this fundamental Christian identity. We're seeing the creation of things called states or nations, which may have as a component Christianity, but that is not the be-all, end-all of the identity, right? And so this is one of the key factors in the growth of a new kind of thinking about Jews, a new kind of Jewish animosity, which is anti-Semitism. There needs to be a new basis, in other words, for excluding Jews from the society, the community, and specifically from the state or the nation. There is a well-developed literature, and this is something that it's difficult to summarize briefly. I will do the best I can, but there, I mean, from really the end of World War II, and even to some extent before this, there has been a robust, well-developed literature about the psychology of anti-Semitism. If you're interested in this, I might recommend especially the works of Hannah Arendt, a mid 20th century social theorist. Began her life in Germany, but immigrated to the United States and became a professor at in New York. I can't remember exactly where, either Columbia or NYU, I believe, and wrote a number of important works of philosophy and of political theory. Her most important, arguably, was, well, there are a couple that I would mention. One was her account of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961. This is a Nazi official, really kind of the architect of the whole final solution, who was caught and arrested in Argentina, and clandestinely shipped over to Israel, where he underwent a trial, which was kind of broadcast internationally in Jerusalem. And Hannah Arendt wrote a work about this called Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I may have some things to say about that work later on when we talk about the Holocaust, and about Nazism more generally. The other work that she wrote, and the one that's most, I think, germane for the discussion we're having about anti-Semitism, is this work called The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I'll mention a couple of her ideas from that in the course of this discussion. Another thinker along these lines is the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote a work called Anti-Semitism, or Anti-Semite and Jew, where he, delves into the psychology of this. And anyway, he's another thinker that we would pay attention to. And then a couple of lesser known figures, though certainly for anybody who studies anti-Semitism, they would be known. The first of these is a guy named Gavin Langmuir. He's been dead for 20, 25 years, but spent much of his career at Stanford. He locates the origins of anti-Semitism in some of the irrational behaviors of Christians persecuting Jews in the Middle Ages. And so he traces it all the way back to that time. And Langmuir has a couple of important books on this regard. I'm in my office right now actually looking at two of them on my shelf. One of them is called Toward a Definition of Anti-Semitism, and the other one is called History, Religion, and Anti-Semitism. I had to crane my neck over to look at the title of it. But Langmuir says that in things like the host desecration accusation and the blood libel accusations of the Middle Ages, we begin to see an irrational explanation for why the Jew is unacceptable in the society. And this has to do, in Langmuir's view, with the Christian's inability to reconcile the doctrines of his own religion. That is, he is uncomfortable with philosophical formulations like transubstantiation or the incarnation, and thus has to sort of broadcast that irrational interaction with his own identity onto the figure that he then calls inimical or irrational, which is the Jew. Now, I realize that took some kind of mental calculus to go down that path. But in Langmuir's view, put simply, the fundamental feature of anti-Semitism is that it is irrational. And he finds the beginnings of this irrational explanation for why one should hate Jews in things like the host desecration accusation. And he then traces it forward into the modern era. Langmuir's views are really well respected, and I personally find them quite compelling. I think that differentiation is important. Another one, and this is a very actually more recent scholar, David Nirenberg, who is currently a professor at the University of Chicago, spent some time at Johns Hopkins and at Rice University earlier in his career. But he has written a work called Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. And he is, I think, the foremost proponent of this differentiation between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. So anyway, those are just a couple of thinkers to be aware of here, who have helped us understand these things. So this notion about irrational accusations, that's Langmuir's view, and it's, I think, tremendously important. Arendt, though, finds much of the origin of anti-Semitic thinking in the Industrial Revolution and in the establishment of a large segment of European, or rather Western society, which she calls the déclassés. These are people who do the kind of middling jobs that cut them off from anything truly meaningful. And so these would be everybody from the kind of middle managers to people working on the assembly lines whose lives consist of rote and repetitive tasks, who don't feel like they are actually making anything on their own. And this, in Arendt's view, leads to a great deal of kind of hand-wringing or psychological aphasia, people worried about their existence but have no kind of concrete thing to latch onto, and especially with the decline of Christianity as an identity marker. The déclassés become a hotbed for political dissent. And this may be something, these theories may be cast forward, I think, into the 20th and even 21st centuries, that we might see that there is a kind of discontented mass, that populists like Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders or or in other countries, people like Marine Le Pen in France, or maybe even Boris Johnson in the UK, that they can latch on to these people and claim to represent them. Well, in the 19th century, this group of the déclassés they often latched on to politicians who held anti-Semitism as a kind of political platform. Why would they do that? Well, because the politicians who argued that Jews ought to be excluded from the society claimed that the Jews were the ones responsible, in large part, for the kind of discontented existence of all of their of the déclassés, of these people who were cut off from anything meaningful, that the Jews were the ones who had seized all of the opportunities and left these as one scholar, Max de Montt, puts it, the frayed white collar class of people. In other words, they don't rise to the position of full management. They're not really in control of anything. But this is the kind of lower middle class who, again, are really cut off from anything meaningful. That they're cut off that way, that they're divorced from a meaningful existence, because the Jews have taken control of all of those things and they're keeping everyone else in subjection. Now, I realize, and this is actually the point, that kind of thinking is irrational. But it becomes palatable, and even for some, the only explanation for why things are so bad, or why our lives suck, right? In a way, in a similar way that xenophobia and other things function, I think, in more modern politics. That if things are going bad for us, if there's a lack of opportunities, well, it must be because we have all of these foreigners or all of these immigrants in our society, right? And we're seeing this, I think, all over the West, that there's a new kind of populism projected against foreigners, whether that be people from Latin America in the United States, or people from Africa and the Middle East and Europe. That were, this is something that seems to be repeating, and it's, I think, fairly troubling that that's the case. But in the 19th century, the Jews where they were special targets for this kind of hand wringing, this kind of animosity, right? So the Jew becomes a scapegoat for the social ills. And we can look at a couple of these images here. Let's look at the one at the bottom. Um, the caption here says Musée des Horreurs, the Museum of Horrors. And the person being depicted here is Le Baron Alphonse. This is Alphonse Rothschild, um, the head of the Paris family of Rothschilds. And he is portrayed as a kind of monster, an almost, well, this is a Dantesque satanic monster here. Also a pirate with the eyepiece, and he's got these claws reaching into this chest of gold, and he is the one who controls everything, right? So he's responsible for hoarding the money, for hoarding all of the opportunity, and keeping all of these other people in subjection. He becomes the scapegoat for everyone's social ills. And along with that, there's this perception that the Jews are in control, that they are greedy, that they want to dominate the world finance and all of the world economy, and keep everyone else in subjection. This, by the way, is a complete reversal of the position that Jews held in previous centuries, where they were purposefully kept down, limited in the opportunities they had, and all of this was done to humiliate them. The Jew in the Middle Ages and the early modern period was seen, for the most part, as a bumbling fool who, simply couldn't get it right. And if he would just convert to Christianity, maybe he would have more opportunities, but he needs to be kept in his place. This is a complete inversion of that. Now the Jew is the one on top, and the Christians are the ones who were kept down by the kind of backroom machinations of these Jews. Now, nationalism also contributes to this, and in particular, the idea, and this comes from Hegel, among other philosophers. Hegel's the most important. This idea of a national spirit, right? So the whole idea of a nation is kind of a creation of the Enlightenment period, especially of the revolutions, the American, the French revolutions. And we see the establishment of the nations of Germany and Italy in the 1860s and 1870s, right? So Europe is heading in the direction of nations. But this is not just a set of boundaries and a political system, and even a culture, and tied often to whatever the main spoken language is within the nation. There's also this philosophical, conceptual formation that goes along with that. And this is a major part of the rhetoric that gets thrown around in the presses of these emerging nations, in the novels, in the works of art, in the music, in things like opera. We'll talk about Wagner in a bit here, and his contribution to this idea of the Aryan race. But there's this whole idea that there is a national spirit, that every nation has this current, and this is, part and parcel of the culture, but the idea is that a nation needs to feed its spirit or its soul, that it needs to keep it pure, that it needs to have room to express its spirit, and that its spirit will be inevitably in competition with the spirits of other nations. And if that sounds a bit, spiritual, sorry for the terrible pun there, or a bit esoteric, it kind of is, actually, right? But I mean, this is sort of fundamental to the 19th century way of thinking, And by that score, the Jew who lives in every nation, I mean, there are Jews in every nation, every one of these emerging nations in Europe, the Jew is a threat to the national spirit because the Jew cannot be a Frenchman or a German, right? Now, there's less of this kind of rhetoric, anti-Semitic rhetoric that we find in Britain, though there is some. This is particularly acute on the continent, and it has to do, again, in large part with this idea of a national spirit that can be weakened by the presence of a pathogen of some kind, right? And we've already seen that this is one of the big debates about Jewish assimilation, right? Can Jews become Frenchmen or Germans or Italians or Brits? Is it possible for them to do that? Can a Jew say, I am a Frenchman who just happens to practice Judaism as a religion, or will the Jew always have his primary loyalty to the religion and to this whole idea of the nation of Israel, or the people of Israel, with the promised return, coming of the Messiah and the return to the Jewish kingdom and all of that, right? All of this biblical language. There's a good deal of skepticism in Europe with these emerging nations that Jews can be good Frenchmen or good Germans or good Italians, right? And that added to this whole idea of a national spirit and the potential weakening of a national spirit creates a kind of terrible mix of attitudes that culminates in anti-Semitism, which becomes, as we'll see, very destructive. Add to this, now I realize we got a lot of complex ingredients going into anti-Semitism here. Add to this social Darwinism. Now, Darwin's theories are applied not only to science and its challenge to traditional kind of religious formulations about how the world works, how the Earth came into being, and all of that, right? Darwinism is applied to the social sphere as an explanation for why human societies take the shape they do. Um, and, uh, and this goes hand in hand with this idea of the national spirit in competition with other national spirits, right? So, social Darwinism claims that not all people are equal, that we all are just the sum total of the genetic information that has been passed on to us, and that only the fittest will survive. Therefore, we need to craft societies that have the best possible characteristics. Okay. That if we mix in things that weaken the race, and this is where the term race is born, that weaken the race, which is seen as a fundamental set of genetic characteristics, right? Biological characteristics that, are tied to this idea of a national spirit, right? That if that is in some way compromised, then the national organism cannot survive because its genetic information is weakened, right? There are pathogens in the system. And I realize I'm using this rhetoric in the midst of a global pandemic, and I guess that's all the richer the irony for all that, right? But scientific racism is something that develops, I mean, independently of anti-Semitism, meaning it predates anti-Semitism, but this is it's this whole conceptual space that allows racial anti-Semitism to evolve. In other words, the idea that Jews are a race of people, and that this racial characteristic or racial formulation is fundamental to what it means to be a Jew. By this score, a Jew who converts to Christianity is still a Jew, because race is something that cannot be changed if somebody changes behavior. It's biological. It's intrinsic, right? Um, and some thinkers developed the idea that the Jewish race is one particularly potent, but also two a particularly destructive pathogen, right? That mixing in the Jewish race will weaken the national spirit and the racial characteristics of the nation more than mixing with anybody else, right? And this is because, well, the Jew is present, right? Africans or Asians, in other words, people of the Negroid or Mongoloid races, as they were called in these 19th century terms, are not present in large numbers, but Jews, the Semitic race, is present in large numbers, right? And that racial mixing presence is corrosive. It's something that must be excised, even if it takes major surgery to do so, right? And so, that's another major contributing factor to the development of modern anti-Semitism. Going along with that is this whole science of eugenics, right? And this is a kind of outgrowth of social Darwinism. It's the idea that if we want to have a society that works at its optimum capacity, we've got to get rid of parts of the society, components of the society that drag it down. In other words, those who are unfit to contribute must be removed as a corrosive agent in the society, right? And this is where we get ideas about, well, I mean, mass euthanasia, but more commonly forced sterilization and laws against miscegenation with components of the society that are seen as corrosive, right? And so mix all of these together, and we're going to get eventually Nazi racial theory. Now, all of this, I think, hopefully, to 21st century ears, sounds absolutely insane, right? Totally irrational. Again, that's kind of the point of all of this, right? But in the 19th century, and even in the early 21st century, up until the end of World War II, anti-Semitism was seen as a viable and acceptable political stance, right? There are major politicians all over the West, all over Europe, even in the United States, who have as essential components of their political identity this argument that Jews are not worthy to be in our state, in our nation. Okay. And so there's a political poster up here on the upper left of the slide, for instance, right, which says essentially that the Jews do not belong in France. This is a French member of Parliament, I believe, right? You can see Adolphe Willet, candidat antisemite. So the anti-Semite candidate for the ninth arrondissement, in other words, a member of parliament for a particular sector of Paris, and he's trying to get elected on the basis of this argument that if he's elected, he will remove the Jews from French society. Okay, and that's enough of a platform, so to speak, that some of these anti-Semitic candidates for major political offices ended up winning. And much like we find parties in Europe today that are, well, some of them are even anti-Semitic, but that center around specific issues. Like in pretty much every major Western democracy, there was a Green Party centered on environmental issues. Well, in the 19th century, there were in pretty much every country in Europe anti-Semitic parties and viable candidates from those parties, and this was an acceptable thing to state in the public space. Now, there's also um, a a kind of intellectual history to anti-Semitism. And by that, I mean a history of ideas where we can trace this from one thinker to another, and look at the way they each contribute to this. So I want to go through a few of these key thinkers, most of them from the 19th century, some of them from earlier. But all of this to get a kind of well-rounded picture of how anti-Semitism develops as an idea, how it becomes part of kind of common discourse politically, socially, and intellectually in Europe. Right now, we might go back to um, the all the way back to something we talked about earlier in the course, which is a figure like Martin Luther from the early 16th century. He wrote this book on the Jews and their lies. He wrote a number of other works. This was late in Luther's life, in fact. Early in his life, in fact, all the way up until the last few years, he had been very kind of positive. I'm not going to say philo-Semitic or somebody who was really friendly to Jews, but he believed strongly that if Christianity would just get its act together, the Jews would happily convert and would become Christian. When he realized that wasn't going to happen, he became virulently anti-Jewish, and even began to argue more or less that the Jews were corrosive, right? That this was not good for Christian society, and not just on religious grounds that they were believing the wrong thing, but that the Jews were just didn't belong in society at all, right? That they were fundamentally liars, that we shouldn't believe anything they say, and that we need to have an active program of forcing them either out or to assimilate, right? And so he says, among other things, we need to bring the full weight of the political system and the law against the Jews. We need to declare the Talmud illegal and take it from them so they stop passing around these lies that they've been propagating for generations. We need to make them convert. We need to prohibit rabbis from preaching or doing any kind of rituals. And he gets really serious about this, and incredibly oppressive in his prescriptions that he's making. Well, I bring up Luther because I see that as a kind of forerunner to some of the arguments that are being made in the 19th and especially the 20th centuries. And in fact, some of these later thinkers refer back to Luther and to his ideas. And so he is, I think, an important forerunner to some of these things. Coming into the 19th century more directly, there are a few thinkers that I will mention here. The first of these is a French intellectual named Arthur de Gobineau, who did not write a work specifically about Jews, but his work from the 1850s, late 1850s, early 1860s, something like that, called The Inequality of Human Races, was this is a watershed work. This is probably the most widely read work in the 19th century about race. This is the one that supposes, for instance, that there are, that race is a fundamental intrinsic category of human existence, and that different races are fundamentally unequal, right? That some are superior and some are inferior, that the European Caucasoid race is superior. And he was among the first who began to use terms like Aryan to describe. And Aryan is important, and it's tough to characterize exactly what that meant, right? Aryan is a reference to the Proto-Indo-European speakers. This is in a time when linguistic theory was beginning to develop, and linguists were beginning to notice that there were commonalities between these different European languages, that they shared underlying characteristics, or structures, I should say, that were similar to each other, and thus they must have descended all from a common ancestor. And they named this whole language category, which included pretty much all the European languages minus a couple, the Indo-European language family. And the Indo-European speakers then also seem to, or according to this extension of that thinking, were a race of people. Well, the original Indo-European speakers, in Sanskrit at least, are called the Aryans. If we go all the way to the Indian system, the development of Indian society in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, right? The Vedic India. These are called Aryans, and so these European racial thinkers latched onto that term, and they said there is this Aryan race, and it needs to be protected. It is superior, but we cannot allow this to be kind of watered down, or the impurities introduced into it. Okay, and that there was something about blood, in fact, that was fundamental to this. I was going to read here in a book that I had open in front of me. De Gobineau introduced the concept of one single cause behind the fall of all civilizations, the dilution of the superior blood in aristocracy by the inferior blood of the common people. Now, one of the things we need to know about Arthur de Gobineau was that he was a count. He was a nobleman, and this in an age after the French Revolution. He was an opponent of the revolution, of course. But in his mind, the common people were from a different race than the nobility, and that what needed to happen was the noble blood needed to be preserved. Okay, well, de Gobineau's ideas were taken, and other thinkers began to run with them and to lay out all of these theories of race. And from this, thinkers specifically talking about anti-Semitism, or about the Jewish race, would take his ideas and come up with this concept of anti-Semitism. Arthur de Gobineau himself did not specifically talk about the Jews. What he did was laid the foundations for racial thinking generally. Friedrich Nietzsche, and his relationship with Judaism is complex. I was reading an article earlier today about Nietzsche and the Jews, because I've never been able to completely wrap my head around this. Nietzsche was, I think, more an opponent of Christianity than he was of Judaism, largely because Christianity was the majority religion, and Nietzsche was trying to undercut and to remove religion as a basis of morality generally, right? And so I don't know that we can fault Nietzsche necessarily for being an anti-Semite, other than he was trying to create a totally new moral order. What we do find in Nietzsche are some ideas that are embraced by anti-Semites, and particularly by the Nazis. And this is where the whole legacy of Nietzsche really becomes problematic. So a couple of these, just to just to acquaint you with this, right? Nietzsche proposed in a number of works, but especially in one of his most important works called Beyond Good and Evil, the idea of the Übermensch. Okay, the Übermensch, or this is often translated as the Superman, but that's not a terribly good translation. It just means literally it would be the overman, meaning the one who is better than everyone else, right? The Übermensch in Nietzsche's mind is one who is superior to others because he has transcended the moral order that keeps people in subjection. He does away with the concept of good and evil. The Übermensch acts because he has the will to act and to do what he knows needs to be done. Now, there's a lot more to the concept of the Übermensch than that, okay? But where Nietzsche enters into this story is that he introduces the idea that we needn't worry about violating some sort of moral code in protecting what is important. Now, if you combine that with kind of racial anti-Semitic thinking, if the Jews are a race that corrodes the national spirit, well, we shouldn't be concerned then with some sort of moral code that says, well, we can't kill people, right? Or we have to, because these are human beings, we have to be nice to them, right? If there's a will in the nation, and this is Nietzsche's other concept, the will to power, okay, if one has a will, one can do whatever one wants, or whatever one knows needs to be done, right? If that means exterminate the Jews, or evict them, or do away with them entirely, well, the Ubermensch would say, let's do it. We need to do it. In fact, it is an imperative that we do this. Okay. Um, and so, I mean, Nietzsche gets, his works sort of get bastardized by later thinkers, and especially by the Nazis, right? They take his ideas about the Ubermensch, about the will to power, and this becomes uh, really the kind of core of their rhetoric. If you watch the Nazi propaganda film Triumph of the Will, with Nietzsche open in front of you, you can find reference after reference, even though they don't quote him directly or attribute anything to him. I mean, this rhetoric is what's adopted by the Nazis. Taking from de Gobineau's ideas about a superior race, we see that applied more directly and with obvious anti-Semitism in a number of thinkers. Okay, in France, there's a guy named Edouard Drumont who writes a work called La France Juive, the French Jew. Okay, and Drumont. This is in the 1880s and 1890s. Drumont proposes that actually, let me deal with Wagner and Chamberlain. I'll come back to Drumont because he, even though he's French, is more fundamental to the idea or to the development of the idea of anti-Semitism. Because we're headed for the Nazi Holocaust here, we need to bring in Richard Wagner and Houston Stewart Chamberlain. These are two German thinkers. Chamberlain is actually born in Britain, and was from a family of landed gentry, I believe. But he spent most of his life on the continent and eventually became German. Even ended up marrying the daughter of Richard Wagner 25 years after Wagner's death. So the two didn't actually know each other, but Chamberlain saw himself as the protector of the legacy of Wagner. Now, if you're not familiar with Wagner's work, if you don't know 19th century classical music or anything like that, Wagner wrote works, and particularly operas, that were taken from German folklore of the Middle Ages. And in Wagner's mind, he was trying through this artistic endeavor to locate a German race that was uncorrupted by later accretions or kind of impure introductions into the German race, like, well, Christianity, for instance, right, which he saw as just an outgrowth of Semitic thinking. That there was a pure German race before that, and that's what needed to be admired. And he found this in these medieval poems, especially the Nibelungenlied, which is the text that informs Wagner's most ambitious work, which is called the Ring Saga or the Ring Cycle. This, I believe, if it's performed in its entirety, takes about 24 hours. It is rarely performed in that manner. It has to be a marathon opera session to pull that off. Usually it's performed only in part. but he finds these German characters like the warrior Siegfried, or the German maiden Brunhilde, who was romanced by Siegfried, uh, as the kind of pure German race, which is good, militaristic, Teutonic, and has these kind of pure fundamental racial characteristics. They're blonde, they have blue eyes. I mean, this is all part of the thinking of Wagner. Well, Chamberlain, once he made it to Germany and began to steep himself in the literature and art and music of Germany, and became especially acquainted with the operas of Wagner, didn't just fall in love with this, but he became the kind of chief voice in the intellectual space for the furthering of these notions. Chamberlain, in particular, wrote extensively about the superiority of the Aryan race, and importantly, about the threat that the Jews posed to the purity of the Aryan race. Right, and so Chamberlain was an ardent anti-Semite, one who saw the Jews as something that had to go in order to preserve the purity of the Aryan blood of the Germans, and that all things that were associated with Jews, even Christianity for that matter, needed to be excised. Although Chamberlain did argue rather vociferously in his most important work, which was called The Foundations of the 19th Century, written, I think, around 1905, if I'm not mistaken. But he argues that Jesus was not Jew, that he was actually an Aryan, and that the Christianity that he was preaching was an attack against the Semitic origins of things like the Law of Moses and stuff like that, right? That this was, in fact, an Aryan moral code that Jesus was introducing into this, and that he was killed by the Semites, right, for doing that, and then it was later corrupted. And so, he didn't entirely do away with Christianity, but he did try to make this a racial thing as well. Drummond is, I think, the foremost intellectual voice in the 19th century for anti-Semitism. Writing in the 1880s and 1890s, he is the one who proclaimed in loudest terms that the Jews were conspirators, that they were all part of this international attempt to dominate all of the key structures of the world, to the point where Europeans, races who were not Semitic, and Christians would be kept in subjection, even in slavery, to them. Right. There is the image at the lower right of the slide here, shows one of the Rothschilds, and I don't know exactly which one this is. I think it's Israel Rothschild. That's the caption here. If there is an Israel Rothschild, I'm not sure. Anyway, if you look closely here, you can see he's, again, kind of draconian. He's got like webbed fingers and claws and stuff like that, much like in the previous slide we saw Alphonse Rothschild shown as a monster. He's wearing a kind of devilish crown here. And what is at the center of his embrace of the globe? Well, it's France. Right. This is Europe. You can see here's the Iberian Peninsula down here, and France is firmly in his clutches. And Drummond, of course, being French, was riding, sounding a warning voice against the corruption the Jews were introducing into the French nation. I mean, this is an important precursor to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which we already talked about in this class, which was a kind of Russian production. This was compiled most especially by a Russian monk named Sergei Nilus, who was commissioned to do so by Tsar Nicholas II. but these ideas were already circulating even decades before, well, 10, 15, 20 years before Nilus got a hold of all of that and put this into its the form of the Book of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. One of the things about Drummond, and I've kind of commented on this already, but this is important, so let me underscore it. He was saying that the Jews were able to dominate because they were clever, because they had a hold on things, because they had formulated these ideas and kept them secret from everyone else, but that they were outsmarting the Aryans, or they were outsmarting the Caucasoid races. They were corrupting them. They were seizing control of everything that was important. And so this is the complete inversion, like I was saying earlier, the complete inversion of the social position that the Jews had held for most of their existence in Europe. That is, where they were kept in subjection, where they were limited in what they could do. Drummond is imagining here a Jew who is fully in control of everything and enslaving everyone who was not Jewish. Right? Now, from this comes Nazi racial theory, and we will get somewhat into that. But if you look at a figure like Alfred Rosenberg, who was one of the key, he was Hitler's racial theorist. He was tasked specifically in the Nazi Party with writing works of racial theory. But even Hitler himself, or Goebbels, or some of the other Nazi thinkers, right? They are grabbing strands of all of these intellectuals. They're grabbing some Nietzsche. They're grabbing some racial theory that goes all the way back to de Gobineau. They're still talking about Jews as a threat to Christianity in the vein of Martin Luther. They're latching on to the ideas, the ideas of Aryan superiority that are introduced by Wagner and Chamberlain. They are claiming that the Jews are part of this international conspiracy, a la Edouard Drummond. And they are even circulating as truth the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Right? All of this ends up converging in Nazi racial theory. Just to acquaint you with the other images here, this is especially pronounced. I mean, it's pronounced in France for sure, but it's especially pronounced in Austria, where Hitler was, of course, came of age and kind of began his career. The top cartoon here, and it's actually cut off, but it says der Fremde, meaning this is the foreigner, the non-resident of, and this is Vienna. Okay, the non-resident of Vienna says to, so this guy is the Wiener, okay, the resident of Vienna. He says, "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me where the Jewish street is?" And then the Wiener says, "Can you tell me which street is not the Jewish street?" In other words, the idea, Jews are everywhere. They have taken over everything. Right? There is no Jewish street or Jewish quarter. The Jews are now in control. They are all over Vienna, and then you got images in the background. You got upscale apartments. Well, the Jews are living in those. You got Jews on the street. Here's a kind of caricature of the fat Jewish banker and all of his minions. You got the Jewish department store up here, and over the course of the 19th century, Jews excelled in retail. The vast majority of all major retail enterprises were Jewish, and so forth and so on, right? The Jews are everywhere. They're in control of everything. It's interesting to juxtapose that with this. Down here in this image, it says Weg nach Osten, so this is, and this is supposed to be Vienna again, or Austria at the very least. The way to the east, and you see here essentially Jewish hordes, right, coming in, taking over Austria, and And this says, we need to take measures against die Pest, meaning the plague, right? That we've got to shut the doors against them because they are corroding everything. And down here, this is maybe the most subtle but powerful of the images. You have a tombstone which says simply Österreich, or Austria, right? This is what's happened to Austria. If the Jews come in, this is the death of Austria as something that exists. So, very anti-Semitic political cartoons here, again, drawing upon the ideas of these various thinkers. There are a number of public scandals that contribute to the popularity of anti-Semitism and, moreover, to its viability as a kind of political platform, its viability as public policy. Okay. In 1840, there's a blood libel accusation in Damascus, so all the way in Syria. This is still in the Ottoman Empire at this point, where a Jewish barber is accused of killing a Christian monk. And there's an anti-Semitic outbreak about this. This becomes an international scandal. And you can sort of trace this through the newspapers all over the world. There were pogroms against Jews in the Middle East and in parts of Europe as a result of this affair. Okay, so I mean, this is a high-profile case where that serves to convince people that the Jews are up to no good, that they are, part of this grand conspiracy to destroy Christianity, to destroy the nations of Europe, and that they've got to be dealt with in some way. In the 1890s, we talked about this already, the Dreyfus Affair, and then in the 1911 in Russia, the Mendel-Baylis blood libel. This is something that Sholem Aleichem referred to in Tevi the Dairyman. These go beyond, in the case of the Dreyfus Affair, go beyond France, or in the case of the Mendel-Baylis case, they go beyond Russia, and these become, international public scandals. They're in every newspaper, talked about constantly. Everyone's concerned about this, all with this thought that the Jews are out to get us, that they're out to control us, and that we have got to do something about them. Right? This again is why anti-Semitism is acceptable and viable, and why people think that this is okay. It is not until the revelations of the Holocaust, shockingly, that anti-Semitism as a position becomes untenable. There are anti-Semitic politicians all over the Western world and in the Middle East, all through the 19th and first half of the 20th century. And we might even see, I think, a resurgence of this in the last couple of decades, that, there's again a kind of anti-Semitic, and this has been called the new anti-Semitism, by the way, and we may talk about that toward the end of the course. So hopefully this has been helpful. I know it's gone on for some time. I wanted you to understand this phenomenon, though, and to have a sense of it so we can be conversant about it. If you have questions, again, please feel free to ask them in the discussion boards. Thank you.